In today's Locked On Pelicans, it's all about the rankings, power rankings, future rankings, and a very surprising ranking for Zion Williamson. Let's dive into the rankings in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Thursday. We are getting closer to Media Day. I will be there. We're going to have all the coverage you want. So whether you're a longtime listener, an everydayer, or a new listener, a new subscriber who's excited about this Pelican season, we're going to have all the coverage you want all year long, including some new things coming really soon that I'm going to be excited to reveal to y'all. But today, we are going to look at rankings, power rankings, player rankings, future rankings. What's that even mean? We've got it all covered for you in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So let's dive right on in. I've been going through a lot of the preseason rankings, power rankings. CBS Sports does a lot of really great overall rankings with players, things like that. And what I found really interesting was the way they viewed Zion Williamson. And I'm going to tell you right now, I think they are exactly correct when it comes to this. There's an article out from the past week about the NBA's top 10 wings. Top 10 wings, you think of Jason Tatum, right? You think of guys like Paul George, Anthony Edwards, LeBron James, all of those. You know who also made the cut here? That's Zion Williamson. Zion Williamson ranked as the 8th best wing in the NBA. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, wait, no, he's a power forward. He's a center. He's a big man. Yes and no. And they give a good explanation for this. Quote, Zion Williamson might be the New Orleans Pelicans opening night starting center. He won't be. It'll be Daniel Tice. Does that make him a big in today's more vague positional dictionary? Reasonable minds can disagree on this, I suppose, but this is my list. I'm going to make a ruling. No, Zion Williamson is not a big man. For starters, he's 6'6", an insignificant rebounder. He's not a rim protector. He cannot credibly defend real centers. The fact that the Pelicans are either going to start him at center or at least play him significant minutes at center doesn't mean that he's a center. It means the Pelicans are kind of screwed. I don't like that line. Whatever. Alas, Williamson is a wing. A power forward to this point on the technical lineup card, but a penetrator who begins most of his possessions either initiating offense like an actual point guard or from the perimeter cutting blocks. From there, he has massive interior advantages due to his power and low center leverage that feeds into his explosive athleticism, allowing him to get momentum going, and then it's a wrap. They are correct about the way that Zion Williamson plays. The Pelicans don't use him as a traditional big man. They do more than the author of this article is stating on this sort of thing. But I do think it's important to kind of look at Zion through a different lens. And so this feeds into something that I've wanted to talk about for a little while here on the show. There's a reason we call him Point Zion. There's a reason why most of his plays start at the perimeter. He's just not a prototypical big man, and they use him in a variety of different ways, but like a wing, but like a point guard is the majority of what they do. When you are initiating the offense like that, when you're not playing with your back to the basket or posting up, and he posts up and he's good at that too, by the way. Zion at the 5, Zion as a center, Zion as a big man is a little bit of a misnomer. This also helps set some of the expectations. And if you're the Pelicans and you're kind of trying to figure out lineup combinations, this sheds some insight into maybe what they're going to do. You know, we've been looking at the starting lineup a lot, and I'm not thrilled with Daniel Tice starting, but there's a reason they want to run a traditional center. There's a reason they were looking to upgrade the center position this offseason. Zion at 6'6", being, not a tremendous rebounder means you need someone like that. You need to have a balance of things in your starting lineup, a balance of talents, skills, and all of that to really succeed with a lineup at the NBA level. Rebounding, something we've talked a lot here for the everydayers of Locked On Pelicans have known as maybe a concern going into the season for New Orleans. And at 6'6", even if we think of him as a center, a power forward, Zion is just never going to be an elite rebounder. And we honestly probably shouldn't view him through that lens or expect that sort of thing from him. You know, you can point to Charles Barkley, but Barkley was such an outlier that when you look at guys that are 6'6", Zion's size, they tend to not be elite rebounders. So maybe we shouldn't be expecting Zion to be an elite rebounder when it comes to things like this. So I think that is something that is worth keeping in mind when we are trying to kind of evaluate him. Should we be looking for him to rebound more than he does? Should we be looking for him to get 10 boards per game? Maybe a little bit more than he does. But overall, I don't think that this is someone that, you know, should be held to that standard of like an elite rebounder. It's just not a realistic thing, in my opinion, when it comes down to it. Compare him to wings, compare him to guards and how they rebound. But then that also means when you're building lineups around him, you need to account for that because, look, you're just not going to get it from Zion. And it also means that when you're playing some of these, players around him, do you need as much creation? Can you run him with a bench group of shooters to give them different looks because he's going to do the majority of creation with it? And I think the answer to that is yes. So to rank him as the 8th best wing, I think is pretty interesting, above Jimmy Butler, just behind Paul George. The rest of the list is Paul George at 7, Kawhi Leonard 6, Jaylen Brown, Anthony Edwards, Kevin Durant, LeBron James, and Jason Tatum. It's actually pretty cool to see. And if the Pelicans, really want to try him at the 3 and different positions like that, you could run some really interesting lineups. Now, that's harder to do because you need stretch bigs with him. You would need a stretch 4 and a stretch 5 to really make that work because with Zion at that number, it's not, at the 3, you need shooting. That's not something they have. So they're never going to truly play him like that. And it's why when we talk about that small ball death lineup, which does feature Zion at the 5 in theory, at least offensively, he's probably not the one guarding centers, and it's going to be other players, whether that's Herb Jones, whether that's Trey Murphy, whoever it might be, you look for that there. So this shed some light on maybe some of the expectations that we want to have for Zion Williamson this year. By the way, of CBS's 100, top 100 players list, the Pelicans have 6 players on it, and that's tied with a couple of other teams for the most. The Knicks, the Timberwolves, the Thunder all have 6 guys on there too, with Zion Williamson being the highest for New Orleans. There is talent here. The question, especially when we get into the power rankings in the next segment, are how do these pieces all fit together, and can they make it work? No one's questioning the talent on this team right now. It's really a question of how do you make it all work? And that's really the difficult part and the kind of big questions going into the season here with the New Orleans Pelicans. They're the top 6 guys they have is Zion Williamson, Brandon Ingram, CJ McCollum, DeJounte Murray, Herb Jones, and Trey Murphy. It's a really strong group there, but does it all fit? How do you make it all work? That's going to kind of be the big question. And when we get into the power rankings in the next segment here, that's why you're seeing the Pelicans kind of in the middle, except for one notable outlier. But let me know, do you agree? Do you disagree with Zion Williamson being classified as a wing? Do you think of him more as a big man? He does post up. He's really good with his back to the basket, has a very quick spin move that allows him to get to the basket and score. But when he scores, does he score like a traditional big, or is he scoring more like a guard, finishing at the rim with left hand, right hand, a lot of touch and finesse there? The answer to that is yes. Let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments down below. So I've got 3 sets of power rankings for you. One of them is different and has the Pelicans kind of high, and I like that. Let's break it down from ESPN, NBA, and The Athletic. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And you're going to get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Whether you want to get on the Pelicans opening night line of -6.5 over the Chicago Bulls, I feel good about that one. The Saints to have a rebound game, bounce back, get that win, or maybe you're interested in the player odds, the player props with Derek Carr, Alvin Kamara if he's going to be healthy. Or maybe you're scared of the offensive line being injured and you're like, we are not touching the Saints lines too or going against them. That all makes sense. So you can get in on the action over at FanDuel.com, America's #1 sports book. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is also brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. And PrizePicks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. All you have to do is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and then you watch the winnings roll in. And now you can win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. So PrizePicks is the best way to get in on the action on sports in most states, including California, Texas, Georgia. And PrizePicks puts their members first, so all withdrawals are fast, safe, and secure. When your picks hit, you can get your money in as little as 15 minutes. So make the games more interesting. Whether you think Alvin Kamara is going to go for more than 55 rushing yards, he also has passing yards or catches and all of that in there. So PrizePicks, the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Download the PrizePicks app today. Use code LOCKEDONNBA and get $50 instantly when you play $5. That's code LOCKEDONNBA on PrizePicks to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. PrizePicks, run your game. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now for your second listen, Locked On NBA. Daily basketball analysis you can't get anywhere else in 30 minutes or less. You want to know more about the Kawhi Leonard injury, missing parts of training camp for the Los Angeles Clippers? We just covered that. I talked about that on Locked On NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make that your second listen today. So let's get into more rankings, power rankings for the Pelicans in particular. We just looked at players in the top 100, Zion Williamson being classified in an interesting way that I like. But I want to look at overall power rankings. There's a lot of talent there in New Orleans. We just said that. 6 players in the top 100. That's tied for the most with other teams out there. That's a good sign. But why aren't people higher on the team a little bit? And I think that's an obvious answer. And when you look at the power rankings from a couple of big outlets here, we're going to look at ESPN, NBA.com, and The Athletic. They're not all over the place. You know, when you look at how these teams are doing and what they've added, it puts them kind of in the middle of the pack here. So let's start with ESPN and their power rankings. They have the Pelicans 14th. The DeJounte Murray deal they acknowledged is one of the bigger offseason trades that was made, but the top question kind of remains for this team. Who is the starting center? And before people seem willing to buy in, you know, New Orleans, as they've always kind of been or often are in just a bit of a prove it territory. Hey, you're missing a starting center. Is that going to be important? Is it not? The answer is we don't really know. I've said I'm worried about the starting lineup, but there's enough talent here that I think the team should be good. To a lot of outsiders, I think that means they're putting the Pelicans kind of in the middle of the pack. They just don't know what to make of this team, let alone in a Western Conference that is very competitive, going to be very crowded. These are kind of open questions. They could be good, they could struggle. So it's leading people to kind of put them in the middle of the pack. NBA.com did it a little bit differently. They did it by conference. The Pelicans, they have 6th in the Western Conference. They knew that they underachieved last year. The Pelicans won 49 games, but they had the point differential of a team that had 54 wins. That's 5 wins off of what the numbers say you should have. And they really struggled in second halves. They were 0-22 when they trailed after the third quarter. To me, that's not the mark of a negative thing. That just means there's so much room to improve. If they were elite coming back and still only had 49 wins, you wouldn't feel particularly great about it. But I see a lot of room to improve with this team. I also don't mind them being 6th in the Western Conference. I do think that The West is going to be really difficult, really brutal. It's going to be highly competitive too. And that gets them out of the play-in tournament. Honestly, I'll take it. I'd rather not go through another one-game, win or go home scenario for New Orleans. Let's just get into the playoffs, have a couple of days to breathe and really plan for the opponent in a way that they haven't always been able to do. And I think that would do wonders for this team being competitive in a playoff series. So 6 in the West makes sense. The questions here is, with the NBA, they even say, key question, is this it? Daniel Tice, Jeremiah Robinson-Earl, and a couple of rookies at the center spot. They talk about playing Zion at the 5, but we know that's not really what it's going to be. So if you do that, how do you create a balanced lineup with rebounding, with defense on there? Rim protection, I'm not as worried about, but some of the minutes last year with Zion at the 5 showed some promise, some didn't. They're saying kind of the same thing. Prove it, show us, and that's what is keeping them from being higher in the rankings, I think, here. And when you look at the Pelicans overall, I think that's fair. That means they're going to be in the mix. They're going to be kind of right in there, but we're not putting them as a top 4 team in the Western Conference right now. I just don't see that, at least today. I think they can get there. I think they can improve with that. And then you also have the Athletic, and this was done a little bit earlier in the offseason here, and they broke them out by tiers, which I think is always helpful. There's the Contenders, which has 4 teams in the Western Conference and the Boston Celtics. And then you have Tier 2, the brink of contention. There's 4 teams in this group, and the Pelicans are actually in that group. You have the New York Knicks at 6 and the Pelicans at 7 here. And the question is, and I like this question, did they get better? Did this team get better? I think adding DeJounte Murray to this team made them better. Losing Jonas Valanciunas will hurt this team. Losing Larry Nance Jr. will hurt this team, along with Najee Marshall too. But those were role players. They weren't the key guys. And I'm big on your main guys are going to give you more success. We love 8th, 9th, 10th men in this league. They're great, but they're often not difference makers. That's making a move around the edges, which if you're already solid at the top is important. But if you're not, then it doesn't truly matter. That's rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, to use that cliche when it comes to this. So the Pelicans did get better, in my opinion. I think it's really as simple as that. And that's what you kind of see here. Now, there's some questions about Murray. I think he's going to have a breakout year for New Orleans, or a bounce back year, whatever you want to call it. The defense wasn't there with the Atlanta Hawks, but I think you put him in just a non-dysfunctional situation. He's going to fit right in and make them even better defensively. I think he fits in exactly what they want to do offensively too. But the question remains about the center. Regarding Daniel Tice, Zach Harper, the author of this, says, I like the Tice addition, but I'm not sure New Orleans can utilize him as a full-time center. That's the question here. And then when I looked at other smaller power rankings, things like that, not as big outlets, one of the big questions around New Orleans was they're not complete yet. The Brandon Ingram question is still looming over everything. And before people want to make a final determination, you see a lot of people saying, they're going to trade Brandon Ingram, so we'll reevaluate this team at the trade deadline when their roster is set going forward. I'm not fully convinced they're absolutely going to move him, though that's the most logical thing, certainly, that could happen. But I do also see a world where if Brandon Ingram does fit in, and I was just on a different podcast, which you'll hear more about soon, talking about this, that, I said the way he gets paid, if you're an everydayer, you've heard me say this too, the way he gets paid is by fitting in here in New Orleans. He'll get a big bag from New Orleans because he's more valuable here than anywhere else. If he does that, that really elevates the team, but it's going to require some introspection, him looking in the mirror. If he does that, this team is going to be very, very good, and they're going to win games because they will be an elite offense with an already really good borderlining on elite defense. And I think when we look back at these power rankings at the end of the season, I think we'll see the Pelicans ranked slightly higher than when they are now. But there you have it. 6 in the West, so in that 12 to 14 range per the NBA rankings. You had 7th in terms of the Athletic, 14 when it comes to ESPN. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. So coming up next, future rankings. ESPN just released these. How does your team look heading into the 2024-2025 season, but what about 2027? Future seasons. We're always trying to think ahead because Pelicans make moves based off of that. We'll break down those moves in the past, what we can expect from this team here too, and where they rank in the future. Is the outlook good? Is the outlook in the middle? I'll tell you what the ranking is. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is my go-to ticketing app. I love going to live events, whether it's sporting events, concerts, comedy, theater, all of that. Just getting out and being with the crowd. It's great, but sometimes it's just a hassle trying to buy tickets to it, and that's why I use Gametime for everything now. They have tons of features that just make it easier. Gametime even has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. They also have the view from the seat before you buy. If you're going to a venue you've never been, you'll see the view from the seats and you can buy exactly what you're looking for. And then if you toggle in the all-in pricing, no surprise fees at checkout, you can buy exactly what you want. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, coming to you every single day as part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube. If you're a longtime listener or follower of my work, I appreciate you. The reason this show exists is because of you. If you're a new listener, we're thrilled you're here. It's going to be a fun season. We're going to have all the insight, the nuance, not just hot takes screaming or anything like that. We're going to give you what you need to know really quickly so you can get on with your day and just maybe enjoy being a fan of the team a little bit more. Now, for your second listen, Locked On Saints. Everything black and gold is what Ross Jackson is talking about. New starting center. How's that going to affect the offensive line overall? Ross Jackson over the Locked On Saints podcast. Make them your second listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Okay, let's get into more rankings. The final set of rankings we're going to look at here. And this is the future rankings from ESPN. I always love these. We can look at this season. This season matters. But there's also the future. Ooh. But how is this team going to be in a couple of years? They're not a big market team. It's not like you can just reload in free agency. Look, you're not the Lakers where players are just kind of like banging to go to because they want to go play in Los Angeles, or the New York Knicks or the Miami Heat because they want to live in South Beach. You've got to really think long term, and you've seen New Orleans overall, not always, but I do think they've actually done an okay job of all of this. And so the future rankings are out over at ESPN, and they do these every year. And I do have a little bit of a gripe with this, that they really are volatile from year to year. If you were good last year, you're just going to shoot up this. If you weren't, you're going to really kind of fall down, right? The Knicks went from 8 to 3. You have a team like the Dallas Mavericks who were 16th a year ago and now are 15th when they traded away more future first-round picks for other guys that I don't think are going to make a massive impact. And so they're kind of just building some of this off of the success you had this year. But teams are graded into a couple of different categories. And here's how the future power rankings work. There's players, and this is the majority of the score. Current players and their potential for the future, factoring in expected departures. Management, quality and stability of front office ownership coaching, money, projected salary cap situation, ability and willingness to exceed cap and pay luxury tax, market, appeal to future acquisitions based on team quality, franchise reputation, city's desirability as a destination, and then draft, future draft picks and draft positioning. The Pelicans don't get a high ranking after 4 years being kind of up there in this. They are 16th this year. They were 17th last year. The players, the most important part of this, they rank as 14th here. And I find that to be pretty interesting. And I think this underrates the overall talent of the team. I think a big question about the Pelicans here is what happens with Brandon Ingram. If he walks or you trade him for parts, whatever it might be, you're going to go down in terms of talent. That makes a lot of sense to me. But I think 14 is too low. 6 players in the top 100 per CBS is really up there when it comes down to it. Zion was healthy last season too, and Murray made this team better. But they did lose some of the draft aspects, but they're still top 10 in that according to ESPN. So I think they're in a good position. What hurts them are really 2 categories here, and that's management at 20th. And that's more likely due to ownership. They're not going to pay the luxury tax, it feels like, this year, even if they should. That's going to drag you down. And market. It's just not the most desirable market overall for people. And they don't have kind of that pedigree of success that makes you maybe trust them, even if there's a different regime here than there's been in the past. And I think that's what's really hurting them. The draft overall is good. They look at the Pelicans as 15th in money, and I think that's rather interesting, in my opinion, because they're probably not going to do that. And they're over the luxury tax right now. They're somewhat limited. But by not taking on some awful contracts, and guys are tradable like CJ McCollum, Brandon Ingram, I think that does give them a little bit more leeway when it comes to it. And maybe there's the hope that one season, this team will in fact pay the luxury tax if they're in position to really kind of book it and go for it. And I think they kind of view it as that. But they've definitely been passed by some other teams that you don't like to see when it comes to overall rankings. And market, by the way, being 25th, the only teams that are worse than them in terms of market are Cleveland, OKC, Utah, Minnesota, and Detroit. Portland's above New Orleans. Memphis is above New Orleans, but not by much. Sacramento is slightly. A lot of those teams are kind of in the 20s, but that's an area that New Orleans is going to have a tough time, cracking in that. OKC is 1 in this. That kind of makes sense, in my opinion. I don't agree with Dallas at 5. A lot of this, they say, is due in part due to the rise of Derek Lively II, but I do think he's a little bit of a limited big man. Houston at 7, yeah, they have some good draft capital, but the talent really is a big question there too, I think, with some of those guys. It feels like they do need to make a bigger trade. Can they kind of figure that out? Golden State being 9, with an aging Steph Curry, losing Klay Thompson is a big question to me. Like, I don't believe flexibility makes you better. Kyle Anderson, Buddy Hield, that doesn't make them a better team than if they had Klay Thompson for the most part. And they're very limited in terms of draft capital and things that they can do. And so I don't love these rankings. I really don't agree with a lot of them. I think the players for New Orleans should be higher. We're definitely overrating flexibility for some of these other teams. It's why the Clippers are so low in this ranking, because they have tons of flexibility, but they lost the top talent, right? So that should kind of apply to New Orleans too. Maybe there's a slight lack of flexibility, but the talent is there, and that's the most important thing. Let me know what you think about the ESPN future rankings. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Is that too low, too high? Let me know what you think in the comments down below about any of the rankings here. Where would you put the Pelicans this season in your power rankings? If you're ranking every team 1 through 30, what are the Pelicans? Let me know in the comments down below. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. I appreciate y'all listening so much to the show. Tomorrow's show, we're going to talk about storylines, Media Day. Same thing on Monday, too. I will be at Media Day. We're going to bring you great coverage from that as well. I'm excited about it. I hope you subscribe. I hope you're going to be along for the season ride. It's going to be a lot of fun. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NolaJake on Twitter. And we'll be back with y'all tomorrow here on the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.